experience with their teenage daughter, who was one moment a vibrant young woman who was a softball player, and the next moment a vegetative, soon-to-die person because she got struck by lightning. So what did the mother do after her daughter died? She went on this mad campaign to get lightning detectors put in all the parks. And she succeeded. And in fact, they have lightning detectors, which basically say if the barometric pressure is such and the static electricity in the air is such, then it's high likelihood for lightning. So now they've got parks, at least some parks in Florida, where there's this thing comes and goes beep, 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 lightning possible. And everyone's supposed to get off the field or whatever. Well, it's a perfect example of why we don't fucking try to prevent people from getting struck by lightning. Just because shit happens occasionally doesn't mean we have to legislate solutions to it.
Yeah, that's an extreme example, and I can agree with that. And should we go to war with alligators in Florida because, they kill a couple of people a year?
No, we shouldn't. So the thing is, it's like the Patriot Act is the lightning detector thing, the lightning detector excuse used to do terrible fucking things to the Constitution and rights and individuals and stuff, and to justify unjustifiable behavior. And that's what they do. They make exceptions and excuses. But the thing is, the Patriot Act didn't come with those red exclamation points, and it didn't have any sort of test in place to say, is this actually necessary? Do we have an ongoing problem with this?
And most Americans were against the Patriot Act, from both left and right, by a huge margin.
Yeah,
but when you have bought-off politicians you have legalized bribery in this country. I think you know that. Then it's anything that the public wants or don't want is ignored by our representatives.
Okay, but listen, listen, Washington. I'm going to be running for president. I am sort of technically for 2020, but kind of half-assedly. I'm expecting to run really seriously in 2024. And it doesn't matter if a corporation gives me billions of dollars. They're going to. But let's say some corporation gives me $10 million as a campaign contribution. It doesn't matter because they will have given it to me because they think that I'm going to best represent their interests because of my politics. If they then come up to me and say, "I remember I gave you $10 million, so now we want you to do this," I'd be like, you gave me $10 million because you thought I was the best person to run for office. You thought I was going to be the best president. And being the best president means not being subject to bribery. So obviously I'm not going to be, you shouldn't even be talking to me. Why are you even coming up here and pretending as though having helped me succeed in gaining the presidency earns you special favors? It earns you shit. It earns you the best president America could have, and you should be happy about that. And that means you don't get to fucking exert influence over me like this. And you shouldn't even want to. The fact that you're trying to makes me think you're scumbag.
But the fact of the matter is that, for example, the NRA
the NRA might give me money. The NRA might give me money. But they're not buying me off. It's because I genuinely have a pro-Second Amendment position on the matter.
You're right. But our politicians do not vote in our interest on gun legislation.
Well, that's a matter of dispute. That's a matter in dispute. The issue, and you're shifting ground, because the issue is it necessarily the NRA is bribing politicians when they give them money for their campaigns? No, absolutely not. Because if the NRA were giving me money for my campaign, it would be because I'm clear on my position on gun rights, and that's not going to change when I get into office. So if I vote in favor of things the NRA likes, well, that's as I said I would.
Okay. But when 95% of Americans want something done with our gun laws to prevent mass shootings, 95% of the American people.
That is an absolute, blatant, bald-faced lie.
It doesn't matter, though.
It's a lie.
It doesn't matter if it's 95%, 99%, or 100%. Or 99.9999%. We do...
If nothing is done, what is that called?
Listen, 95% of America wanted the Japanese interred during World War II. That doesn't make it the right thing to do. That's why we have constitutional limits. We obey the Constitution, we respect natural rights, and we let the chips fall where they may. This is not...
Well, then you're saying you don't believe the American or people can govern themselves.
I don't believe that the most popular perspective on things is what we ought to use to determine law. we have a constitution. That's the law, okay?
The Second Amendment also says well regulated.
Okay, well, listen, I'm not trying to say we should get rid of existing gun laws. There's thousands of them. And you'll note that the vast majority of impacts of gun laws include the arrest and incarceration of people who committed no transgression against anybody. So if I'm driving around in California with a gun, a concealed weapon, I will get arrested and put in jail even if I don't commit any crime with it. So that's a problem.
The law.
But see, most of the impacts then, most of the negative impacts of those gun laws are directed at people who did no wrongdoing. So you have to count those impacts too. You say, first note that the thousands of gun laws we currently have didn't prevent any mass shootings, right? Second, note that what they did do is incarcerate a bunch of people who, most of whom did nothing wrong. If they could use the gun to commit a crime of some sort, then they're guilty of that crime, and that's a good reason for them to go to jail. If they just have the gun illegally, well, then that's not deserving proportionally of punishment because it's not doing any harm to anybody.
Let's say 100% of what you said is true.
It is.
Let's say that is. If almost the entire population believe that we should, for example, have background checks on people purchasing weapons, firearms, why shouldn't that be put into law?
If almost the entire population believes we should deter the Japanese because they're a threat, even though individually there's no indication that any individual is actually a threat, should we do it? If the entire population that gets polled thinks that it's appropriate that the Runaway Slave Act is upheld, should we do it? If the majority of the population thinks prohibition is a good idea, should we do it? No, we should do what was principled.
But we would do what we believe is reasonable, but I would trust.
Why?
I would trust us to make the right decisions.
Why? Because everyone you meet so smart? Do you meet a bunch of smart people in the world that make good decisions about policy and have wise decision-making processes involved and stuff? No. What we have is a bunch of people like that lady when the cop assaulted me who said he's doing his job because there's a crackhead over there and there's children in the house. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with with him assaulting me. Absolutely nothing. But the world's filled with people like that. Do we want to afford their perspective on things more important than principled restraint? Absolutely not.
So how do we get our government to represent us? We decide
that's not the goal. That's not the goal. I'm not looking for a government that represents the people better. I'm looking for a government that respects the rights of the people better. Now, the thing is, the problem with representation is that, for example, why are cigarettes so expensive? Why are the taxes so enormous on this? Well, because the majority doesn't care that it's costing me money because they don't smoke. That's why.
Smoke is bad for your health, host.
Okay, so is stealing more of my money good for my health? Because you notice that raising the taxes didn't stop me from smoking.
A lot now more than ever in history of people smoking less due to.
Okay, but Washington, is it good that it costs me more to smoke? That smoking correlates strongly with poverty as well. It's like poor people are much more likely to smoke than rich people, and ethnic groups are more likely to smoke than white people. So, if we want to tax something, why do we tax something that impacts the poor and disenfranchised groups most?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
I would say that they should put warning packages, warning labels.
They do
in a large extent, and maybe they don't need a tax to high heaven. I can agree with that.
Okay, but that's what happens when we prioritize the majority, the will of the majority, rather than principled restraint.
But that comes down to individual, opinions and ideology. But if
it doesn't.
We decide, maybe more people believe that we should tax cigarettes.
But it doesn't matter. That's the point. Just because the majority agrees it's okay, doesn't make it okay. And we should do what's right, not what's popular.
So regulating firearms more is not is not right to your opinion?
Look, I understand that the right to bear arms is not an absolute right, that it's appropriate that we limit military level firearms from the ownership of people. What I'm saying is, if you want to convince me that a given gun regulation or new gun law is something we ought to adopt, first convince me that it will actually be efficacious, because the existing ones haven't been at all. They've been efficacious only in jailing people who are guilty of no wrongdoing.
I think the evidence has been used in other countries that have.
Other countries it's worked in, sure. You're right. And there's no disputing the fact that countries with very strict gun laws have much lower rates of gun violence than America does. There's no disputing that. There's no disputing that gun laws do work other places. But
you don't find it upsetting to yourself that we decide that we want tougher gun laws on
why do you decide what I get to have?
Can I just ask you guys? Have you guys seen what we have now in the UK in terms of how the cigarette packets?
Yeah, there's awful pictures on them. That's ridiculous. See, fortunately, the United States ruled that sort of rule was unconstitutional, in violation of the free speech rights of the cigarette companies. They may be
it's not just that. They're not allowed to be branded. You just got a black packet like this with the name of the brand written on the front in normal font.
Okay, so see, that's a free speech violation. The Supreme Court correctly ruled that it's reasonable to force cigarette companies to put warning labels on their packages because, after all, their product is dangerous. But they also correctly ruled that it's not appropriate to force them to brand it a certain way, put ugly pictures on it, or other things like that, because that's not a legitimate restriction of their right to free expression. So the thing is, look, the bottom line is this. Sure, if you want to show me a gun law that will actually work, that's going to do some good, that's going to that's going to meaningfully change the impacts, then fine. But don't assume solvency. Just because there's a problem with mass shootings doesn't mean that more legislation is the answer. It usually isn't.
Background checks on people who obviously don't need to own firearms is would you be for something like that?
For something like what?
Just background checks on crazy people.
Background checks on crazy people. Okay, so
yeah.
And would I be in favor of background checks for guns? We already have background check laws.
No, we don't. You can go to what do they call it? A gun show.
We do have those background checks.
No, you can go to
Okay, there are loopholes.
You can go to a gun show and you will have to fill out the paperwork for a background check. They've got stacks and stacks of the paperwork right there, so you can do it because you got to do it.
It's not up to the level of other countries. Is what I'm saying.
When's the last time you've been to one, Wash?
I don't have to be the one that our gun laws are lax.
Okay, but listen, Washington, listen. I agree that the gun laws here are very different than those in most other Western democracies. And that in countries that have very strict gun laws, in those Western democracies, that in fact there are much lower gun violence rates because there are very few guns in the country. Okay, so it's like if you talk about England and you go around and ask every English person you meet if they have a gun at home, the answer is no, almost 100% of the time. There's 0 guns. Now, how many guns are there in America? Do you know the answer? I do.
No.
300 million. Are you planning on banning it in a way that causes those guns that are already existing in the country to be forced to be turned into the police or something? Do you want to have the...
Not by force. We should do like a gun buyback that Australia did. I think that'd be fair.
That's a good way to increase the market for gun sales. That makes it more profitable to sell guns now, because after all, there are fewer guns. And
no, you're doing two things. You're making it tougher to own a firearm, and at the same time incentivize people to turn in their firearms for cash.
Okay, so if you want to do that, that's fine. If you want to say like, let's have a gun buyback program, fine. But are you also banning the sale of new guns?
No, not banning the sale of new guns, because we have the Second Amendment right that the Supreme Court interpret
Okay, so let's
We
say
can have,
let's
but you're just making it tougher for people
okay,
to
fine.
purchase
Fine.
firearms who should not have it.
But let me ask
Right
you
now,
this,
unlicensed
Washington.
sellers-
Washington, let me
Why
ask
would you want to do that
But-
in the first
but
place?
listen-
If what you want to do is decrease gun violence, why do you want it harder
Because gun violence
for
is
the
linked with-
citizenry to have the guns they need to defend themselves from gun
Okay,
violence?
I think that's
Why
a
do
weak
you want
argument.
to harm?
I think that's a weak argument, frankly. I think the self-defense argument is pretty weak. The reason people want guns is irrelevant, and whether or
Why
not
so?
well, because it's irrelevant whether they need it to self-defend, they need it to prevent tyranny, they need to. You don't need it to be able to have it. The fact that they want it for shooting at targets or something is fine. That's a good enough justification to have it. Now, the problem I have with this gun buyback program is, so what you're saying is you can still buy new guns, and we're gonna pay people to destroy old guns. That seems like a good way to incentivize people to destroy their old gun to get a new one. After all, you get paid for it, so now, I'm tired of this gun. I want to trade it in. It's like a lease almost. I just sell it back to the government, and then take the money they give me, and I buy a new gun with it. That'll be cool.
No, I think how
It's like
it
getting a
works
new
is that
phone every year.
I think how it works is like for right now,
But the
unlicensed
needing
gun-
is the
Go ahead.
reason that the Second Amendment uses to justify the absolute prohibition upon restriction of these items. It says these items are so necessary that no restriction.
But they're not
Maybe made
necessary.
against-
They're not necessary anymore in the way that the Constitution indicates. In other words, we no longer expect the citizenry to rise up as a militia as need be. So, as a consequence, if that's the justification,
Who's we here?
I mean, look. The fact is, the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the well-being and protection of the country, or whatever it says.
No. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The right of the people to keep
I
and bear
agree with you.
arms.
Listen, you're on the
We
same
happen to
team
be
as
talking
me.
about a particular subcategory of arms.
Okay,
but
okay, I get you. I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying though is, if you want to say the justification is self-defense, then it would be and that the justification is critical here. Then it would be militia-oriented self-defense that justifies the possession, that justifies
the
the.
militia constitutes the body of armed citizenry of military age.
Okay, but see,
If you're a citizen and you're armed, you're the militia.
okay, fine. That's fine. But the point is, we shouldn't focus on the justification for it, because the statement, regardless of the justification, the right shall not be infringed, is clear cut. If we're focused on the justification, we're opening the door for people to say, well, then let's say what they really argued, what they really justified it for, what the militia means. Let's have a definitional battle over militia. What I'm saying is it doesn't matter. The point is, we have to acknowledge it. In reality, we don't want individual citizens owning things like huge bombs or fighter planes and shit like that. And no individual citizen should want to have one. And
I want one.
okay,
Why not?
well, because there are limits to libertarianism, and one of the limits is weapons of mass destruction. It is true, first and foremost, though, we should note that there wouldn't be any
Why do we have to
weapon.
jump up to mass? What is mass destruction anyway?
We don't-
How massive does the destruction have to be?
We don't. I understand the arguments against it as well. Okay, so I understand
Is
that.
a mortar a weapon of mass destruction?
Listen, let's limit
Yes.
let's limit the question to this: if I could afford a nuclear bomb, and I found a seller to sell it to me, and
If I could afford a 75 millimeter mortar, and
okay, but I'm asking about nuclear bombs though, specifically, because look, a mortar, at least there's an opportunity to defend yourself, right? If I have a mortar and I'm shooting, it may be terrible that somebody dies from my mortar attack, but it's almost
Yes.
certain that I will be put
okay.
down very quickly. Okay, I will be put down very quickly. The problem is, do we want to enable
I think
people?
it's fair to say that nukes are dooms. I think we can say nukes are doomsday devices, and don't fall into category of arms really, unless you're getting onto the state level with.
Okay, but so if we're going to be doing that, then we might as well just acknowledge that we can't parse it literally in the fashion that we would like to and say it's an absolute right, because it's not at that point. And so we have to acknowledge that there are limits to the. It is true that a natural rights, negative rights framework is by far the most correct framework for almost all issues of governance. And yet it's also true that if we apply it absolutely and are attached to it too much, we become ideologues. And no ideology is ever going to be satisfactory to provide guidance in the complex realities of human existence. So what I'm saying is, let's concede right up the bat that that there are limits to the right to bear arms, but let's also point out the fact that we don't need to justify having something with need. For example, I don't need to need marijuana for it to be okay for me to smoke it. I used to legally need it. They'd say, oh, you have to have a medical need, which comprised what? Which meant that there were doctors that weren't even there, right? You'd go in, there'd be a lady at a desk. You'd fill out a paper. She'd fax it to a doctor who's sitting someplace else, and he'd fax back or he'd have a author. She had like signed papers there, basically, and she'd fill out the rest of it and hand you the signed paper, and there you go. And the doctor is just collecting $40 just to click OK. You know, why does that happen? Well, because somebody's expecting there to be a justification of need. There shouldn't be a justification of need. I should own this and use it if I want to, because I don't need to justify why I want it to you. After all, you do shit that I don't like. You don't have to justify it to me. Just because I don't like bananas doesn't mean you need to justify why you have to have bananas. So the thing is, I don't like the idea of worrying about the justification for having the gun. What I like to point out is, what's the justification for arresting the person with the gun? Is it because he's violated someone's rights? If I come up to you as a cop and I have a gun and I'm pointing it at you and I'm arresting you because you have a gun, that's called aristocracy. Your justification for having your gun and my justification for having my gun are irrelevant. If you think that because you're a certain class of person, you get to have that, and I'm a certain class of person, I don't, that's aristocracy. So I don't like that.
Don't forget that it also says well regulated. So if you violated some regulation, then yeah, you should be held accountable.
That's not
legally.
what regulated meant at the time. A well-regulated militia, one that was well equipped and that was.
Yeah, he's right about that, Washington. It's not regulated back then. Didn't mean like regulation. It meant a well-regulated militia is one that's effective, basically, one that has all the equipment they need and that they know how to work together to fight off enemies and stuff. And he's right also about the militia being simply a term for the people taking up arms as a group, and that's fine. So it's basically saying, communities out there, make sure all your males at least get guns. And gather them all together in the field periodically and go, okay, guys, remember, if the British come again, we got to bust out our muskets and, yeah, let's shoot those straw men over there as practice. That's fine.
No, I forgot the Supreme Court ruling, but they ruled some years ago that that's what the language interpreted regulated to mean, that we have the right to pretty much put laws on firearms to wherever.
Yeah, but case law is fucking stupid. Okay, case law makes no sense at all. So they also have ruled recently in Heller, the Heller decision, the most recent gun rights decision, said that a handgun ban in Washington, D.C. was unconstitutional. Why? Because it exceeded the scope of that which the courts have allowed to get past them before. That's not a justification for anything. It's saying, okay, it's just saying arbitrarily, we've decided not to let this happen. It's saying, well, there's not been this big of a regulation before, so we're not going to allow this. This is unconstitutional. But the thing is, the original regulations were also unconstitutional, and especially by the federal government. You could try to argue that the right to bear arms shouldn't be incorporated, and in fact, I don't think the whole thing is incorporated. And you could argue about incorporation as well, but regardless, there's no reason for the federal government to be making this sort of legislation. That's why the states are separate. There are two layers of sovereignty. as far as governance goes, and there are limits to the top layer's sovereignty to decide things for the second layer's sovereignty. Now, sure, the federal government has taken on and taken over this role of determiner of what's okay for the whole country rather than state by state, and states' rights are mostly
I don't
in
think
shambles.
they go far enough. I don't think
States'
they go far
rights.
enough.
Washington, why don't you care about the Constitution at all?
I do care about the Constitution. They say in Article 1, Section 8 that our politicians have the right to look out for our general welfare, just to paraphrase. So if it comes to regulating firearms on a federal
That's not
level,
what it says they have the right to do, though. What's the two? What comes after the two?
Paraphrase.
What comes after the two? It's not to look out for our general welfare. What is it?
Military and
No, what are they doing, though? What's the do part? What's the verb part of that you're referring to?
I'll look it up.
I'm pretty sure it's to tax.
Oh yeah, right.
Okay, so they have the power to tax. If
Yeah,
monies are
for
needed
tax.
for the general welfare in some regard. So, for example, let's say they realized they were under attack since we have no standing army, right? And they needed to raise an army. They had the power to tax to then fund that raising of the army because there's a purposeful use of it that is specifically attending to the general welfare, and the power to raise and maintain armies and navies is a listed power in the Constitution afforded to Congress. So that's fine.
You're right.
It doesn't mean
Yeah, I agree.
they can tax and do whatever the fuck they want, even though we enumerated the powers right here. That's silly. As long as it's not actively malevolent. That's basically what your interpretation says. Is as long as the Congress isn't trying to do something actively malevolent with their tax dollars, they can do whatever they want. So obviously, the Congress isn't going to openly be malevolent. They're going to at least shroud whatever it is they're doing in the language of general welfare. It's not a standard at all. It's not a rule or a standard. It's a license to arbitrariness.
Okay. Well, that was fun. I'll let y'all continue. I'm about to hop in the shower.
All right, Washington. I'm happy that we didn't end up screaming. I'm happy that I didn't end up screaming at you today. Thank you for
Maybe next time.
I'm sorry again for my periodic screaming profanities at you. I'm working on
You know
that.
I love it when you yell at me.
I'm working on it. I'm gonna try. I'm trying to be more civil in general, but not very successfully at the moment. But I'm working on it. Thank you, Washington, for chatting with me. And you guys, I'll see you in a little bit. I gotta go upload this video, and that video I just made with Washington too. He didn't know we were making it.